The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
We've got the will and the commitment to contribute, but we just don't have the people and the equipment that allows us to make good on our promises. And that's where the political hit starts to be felt. Our reputational hit starts to be felt.
Then, later on The Agenda.
As a sugar maker or as somebody that depends on that as a livelihood, you just have to be ready to adapt yourself to whatever the conditions change. Maybe you have to start your harvesting early.
Canada routinely faces criticism that we do not meet our spending commitments as a NATO ally. And recently, the Department of National Defence's own internal reporting painted an alarming picture of the state of the Canadian Armed Forces. And recent polling shows that Canadians increasingly worry about what this all means for the country's presence on the world stage. For more on how to navigate these difficult waters, we're joined in North Toronto by Carrie Buck. She is former Canadian ambassador to NATO, now a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa. And here in our studio, Guy Thibault, a retired lieutenant general in the Canadian Army, a former vice chief of the Defence Staff, who's currently chair of the board at CDA Institute. And Christian Leuprecht, professor at Royal Military College and Queen's University, editor-in-chief of the Canadian Military Journal, whose latest book is called Security, Cooperation, Governance: The Canada-United States Open Border Paradox. And we are delighted to have you two here in our studio. You came from Ottawa, you came from Kingston, a long way to be with us. And Carrie Buck would have been with us here in the studio as well, but I don't know, should we tell the folks, Carrie, you got a broken leg right now?
Yeah, I've got a broken leg right now. You
got a broken leg, so you're in a cast and you're sort of stuck where you are, but we're grateful you could join us via whatever platform it is you're joining us by. Let's put some of the dirty details on the record here. This is according to an internal report by DND. And Sheldon, bring the graphic up. I'll read along for those listening on podcast. Only 58% of the Canadian Armed Forces would be able to respond if called upon by NATO allies right now. 58%. 45% of the Canadian military's equipment set aside for the defense of Europe faces quote-unquote challenges and is considered, quote, unavailable and unserviceable, 45%. At the end of last year, the document says, the military was short almost 16,000 members, a figure encompassing both regular and reserve elements. Our Minister of National Defense is Bill Blair. Those of us in Toronto may remember he was the former chief of police here, and here's what he had to say about our chronically understaffed military.
If what you have been doing for decades is no longer working for you, you can't just keep doing it. And over the past 3 years, more people have left than have entered. That is frankly, it's a death spiral for the Canadian Armed Forces. We cannot afford to continue on that pace. We've got to do something differently.
Monsieur Thibault, death spiral is pretty heavy rhetoric. You agree with that?
Well, I think it's great that the minister is being this transparent about what he's seen in terms of the challenges for the Canadian Forces. And so the way that he's kind of characterized, if on the people side, if we have more people leaving and we don't have people coming in, that's obviously not a situation that can be tolerated. So I think he's saying we could be in a death spiral unless we actually address these issues of both retaining people and attracting new talent to the forces.
Christian, what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, some of this is self-made and some of this is externally imposed. So I think there's multiple challenges. One is the aging equipment and the strain that imposes on the resources available. So take, for instance, a frigate that 10 years ago would have taken 100,000 person hours to ready to deploy, now takes 1.5 million person hours. So ever more money gets consumed simply keeping the aging equipment going. Then you have the significant personnel challenges that by the time you also factor out people who are not deployable for various reasons, you're starting with about 25% down on the staff available to you. But then the government has compounded that by imposing considerable restrictions on contracting. So you could compensate on the personnel side or even on the equipment side with contracting. That is now very difficult as a result of sort of the environment that the political environment that the government has to operate in. And you add to that the spending reductions, so that $1 billion this coming fiscal year and then another $1 billion for the 2 following fiscal years that had already been budgeted essentially to go to maintaining equipment. So now that means the Canadian Armed Forces have to draw on other areas simply to keep the equipment going. And so this is part of the challenge, that we had a defense policy statement in 2017 that backloaded the spending really into the last 3 years and significant spending into the last 2 years. And that is precisely what the government is now drawing back, which now aggravates an already very severe fiscal and personnel situation.
Let me draw upon your four plus decades, right, in the Canadian Forces and ask you whether Air Force, Navy, Army, are they all equally in dire straits right now?
Well, each of the services have different challenges. And, when you kind of look at it, there's been a lot of announcements recently for the Royal Canadian Air Force in terms of new platforms, which is really welcome. But before those new aircraft come on board, we have to sustain the existing fleets. And so they have that challenge of making that transition between the old and the new. The Navy is also, got a number of great future capabilities on the horizon. So it's a very positive, optimistic look for the Navy in the future, but we got to get there. And in the meantime, there's very significant challenges with the submarine fleet, which keeping them operational. These are boats that were bought from the United Kingdom. It seemed like a really good deal at the time, but when you're buying a bit of an orphan and you're trying to sustain it, it makes it for a very expensive proposition. And the Army, of course, is people-centric. And if the central problems for the Canadian Forces are about people, the Army is the one that suffers the most from it. So each of the challenges in the services are quite different. The missions that we ask of them are different. And so when it comes to readiness, each of their particular issues are different in kind from the other service.
Ambassador Buck, I'm going to give you first crack at responding to a comment that I'm going to read here. This is from the United States Ambassador to NATO, Jeyan Smith, who really did not mince words recently when she talked about the percentage of our GDP in Canada that we are contributing to NATO. And here's what she said. Canada is hovering now just above 1.3%. and has no concrete plan to get to that 2%, which is the target, while other allies have made and created plans to get there, if not this year, in the next few years. Those timelines and those plans are important because it showcases a shared commitment and it showcases intent. Here, inside the NATO alliance, and certainly back in Washington, we very much encourage our friends in Canada to develop some sort of concrete plan to meet that 2% pledge. That's Jeyan Smith, U.S. Ambassador to NATO. All right, what do you believe is holding us back, Ambassador Buck, from putting a plan forward that gets us to 2%?
Well, I think it's because we think we don't need to do it. And we think we don't need to do it because of a very long history and because of our geography. So our geography, we don't see direct security threats to our own territory, airspace, maritime space. We haven't traditionally seen direct threats to those spaces, but also our history, because we've relied on the U.S. as a security protector, an involuntary service provider to Canada since we became a country, essentially, and that reliance on the U.S. has deepened. So we think we don't have to do it, but the problem is that the world has shifted radically. So those stats you showed at the beginning, those are stats that are measured against NATO requirements, and the NATO requirements for readiness have been, Jens Stoltenberg said that this is the largest, most demanding ask of allies that NATO's made since the end of the Cold War. So because of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the requirements on NATO allies to have troops not just forward stationed along NATO borders that are close to Russia to send a deterrent message, but also troops that are ready to move in pretty quick order, not just troops, but, Air Force, Navy, Army as well, those requirements of individual allies have really gone up. So the gap between what we're ready to do because of decades of underinvestment in our military, because we think we're safe, we think we're protected, island Canada, coupled with a worsening security situation where the demands are higher on us, mean that that gap is really high between the NATO spending targets and what Canada is spending on the military right now. So the pressure is going to be a lot worse than it has been. That quote you read from the U.S. ambassador to NATO was not a surprise. The U.S. has been saying this quietly and publicly over the years since those NATO spending targets were set. So it's but the gap is really wide right now.
Do you think, Christian, that our fellow NATO allies see us as shirkers?
Well, so look, I think they look at the trajectory that Canada has been on, where the gap continues to grow in terms of what our allies are prepared to spend. And you can see it not in that, just in the overall spending, right? So there's a commitment of 20% spending on equipment and research and development, and Canada is at under 15%. And so relative to other spending, the delta continues to grow. What that means is that you're effectively reducing Canada's voice within NATO, which ultimately has always been the single most important multilateral organization.
Is that true? Like money equals voice? Is it that simple?
There's certainly, capabilities, commitments, and cash. So that's the 3 C's. And Canada has long, for a good 2.5 decades, said, don't worry about the cash, we've got the capabilities and we're making the commitments. And we can see, if you just look at recent months, where Canada is not able to make commitments because it no longer has the capabilities to make those commitments. Why doesn't it have those? Because it can't contribute the cash to the overall enterprise. And so ultimately it means that Canada is reducing itself to not just drafting behind allies, but the inability to steer where that is going. And I would say that in an increasingly volatile security environment, and if we look at the last 25 years, you know, we can leave international security up to the Americans, but I would say let's look at how that's worked out and whether we actually want to take the sort of initiative we showed after World War II in terms of shaping a world that is in both ours and allied interests.
There are going to be people watching us or listening to us right now who are going to say, look, I mean, why should we spend all this extra money when we've got challenges here at home, when we know the Americans are basically our defense policy in a major way right now? What's the argument you would make to those folks?
Well, I think the Canadian Forces, if it's investment in defense and investment in the Canadian Forces, first of all, you're investing in a multi-purpose tool that ultimately serves a number of purposes. And we've seen that the government of Canada keeps turning to the Canadian Forces time and again, whether it be for fighting forest fires, whether it be going into long-term healthcare facilities to help out in a pandemic, or to respond to floods and fires, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief.
Or blizzards in Toronto.
Blizzards in Toronto, search and rescue every day. There's 9,000 search and rescue events happening every year in our country. So you end up investing in capabilities for Canada to have when the chips are down, and when we look at the international security situation, whether it be Canada's far north and the opening up of the Arctic, whether it be what's going on in Asia Pacific, it's investing in insurance for Canada that we have capabilities to respond when the need arises.
So, Ambassador Buck, put us in the room, if you would, when your American counterparts, or frankly from other members of NATO, would come to you and say, you know, it's really not a good look that you guys are always at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to pitching a percentage of your GDP towards NATO. Can you do anything about that? How do you respond?
Say that Canada has contributed to every single NATO mission from NATO's beginning, in one way or the other, participated in one way or the other, that we have some pretty significant and capable military deployments that are core to the alliance. I'd cite here the command of the battle group in Latvia that we took on when I was ambassador in the room, command of the first Iraq training mission as part of the NATO training mission as part of the counter-Daesh coalition, et cetera. So we've got some pretty credible contributions. The second thing I'd say is that the 2% metric isn't really about military effectiveness, and that it's more important to look at what we do with our troops, what we do with our military assets, and some of the political assets that we bring to bear at NATO. All that's good. But the problem is with those recent NATO statistics on spending, which shows that we are the only ally in that quadrant of shame, where we don't meet either the 2% of GDP spent on defense, nor the 20% of defense dollars spent on procurement-related research and development. We're the only ally sitting out there. It gets increasingly harder to make that argument. Yes, we still have credible contributions, but if, for instance, we can't build up the battle group in Latvia to the size that NATO leaders decided we were all supposed to do, if we can't do that quickly enough, it's a situation where we've got the will and the commitment to contribute, but we just don't have the people and the equipment that allows us to make good on our promises. And that's where the political hit starts to be felt. Our reputational hit starts to be felt.
I'm going to ask you a fast Oprah-like follow-up. It sounds like you're saying in your heart you know they're right. Yes?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, there we go. Asked and answered. Very good. Let's do the next question here. A poll conducted by Angus Reid earlier this month showed that 29% of Canadians have listed military preparedness and the country's presence on the world stage as their top priorities. 29%, which may not sound like a big number, except when you compare it to a decade ago, it was 12%. So a lot more people think it is more significant that we are apparently not playing the role that we ought to be playing in the world today. General, what do you think explains that big jump?
Well, I think if Canadians are watching what's going on in the world, whether it be in Ukraine with Russia, whether it be belligerent China, whether it be really an out-of-control North Korea, Iran's interference in a number of parts of the world, like what's going on in the Gaza Strip today, it's not surprising, perhaps, that Canadians are feeling that insecurity that comes from watching the world that we're in. And we have our own challenges here at home that we've seen as a result of climate-related impacts, issues that are in everyday life of the cyber reality, the critical infrastructure. So I think that it's actually important that Canadians sort of are reflecting on the world and are actually contributing to the conversations about, well, what we should be doing in light of all of these changes. So I think it's good to see these kind of changes. I think that the messages that are coming largely out of the national security defense community have been recognizing these changes for some time, but the Canadian public, for what Ambassador Buck already mentioned, we live in a very privileged country, but we're not isolated and we're not immune from these challenges. So I would hope that all of the concerns of Canadians gets translated into kind of conversations at the political level in this country. We actually need to kind of have a consensus built between the political parties about what Canada's role is, what we need to do to contribute to global collective security, to our alliance, to live up to the expectations our partners have of us. And, I think that the defense policy update, which this government has promised 2 years ago, should be that opportunity for them to signal this is what we are going to do in response to these concerns. So we're still waiting. It's a bit disappointing, to be honest, that we haven't had that clear direction yet from the government, because it sends a signal to the members of the forces themselves that this is what we're going to do. It sends a message to our allies, the United States and our partners. It also sends a message to adversaries of our commitment to global peace and security.
I like where you went in the middle of that answer, because you asked a really profound question that maybe we don't spend enough time on. And Christian, I'll get you to speak to it first. Do we have a consensus in this country about what we want our Canadian Armed Forces to be or to do?
Look, I think that's a great question, and that's what a lot of, I think, this debate comes down to, not just in Canada, but I would say among most allies, with perhaps the exception of the United States. Is the purpose of the Canadian Armed Forces to provide regional and international security and stability? Is the purpose to secure open trade routes, freedom of navigation type missions, or is the purpose to do human security type operations?
What do you think it should be?
Well, so ultimately, that's a debate between the government, the people, and the Canadian Armed Forces themselves. And the Canadian Armed Forces think of themselves as a fighting organization. I think the people think of the Canadian Armed Forces primarily as a human security organization. And the government thinks of the Canadian Armed Forces, I think, primarily as an instrument of foreign policy rather than as an instrument of defense policy.
Or domestic economic development.
And each of that has implications for how you posture the force, how you equip the force, and the ability to deploy that force. And politicians want to do, look, politicians, I think, are great masters of the art of the possible. They know that there's no votes or very few votes in a country like Canada in defense and security. And so how do you maximize the payoff that you get for the investment that you make? And I think politicians often ask, what is the return on investment that I'm getting from this organization, in particular in terms of the political objectives that the government of the day is trying to generate? The problem is, of course, the political objectives you generate with the investments you make today aren't for the government of the day. It is in many cases for the governments down the road. And so this is why we end up getting these very short-term perspectives on an organization that ultimately requires very long-term commitments.
I should get Ambassador Buck on that as well. Do you believe there's a consensus in the country as to what we actually want the Canadian Forces to be or to do?
No, and I think part of that is because we haven't had the conversation about what our overall international policy should be. We haven't had an integrated international policy. By integrated, I mean foreign policy and defense for decades now. Almost 2 decades. So I don't think there's a consensus, but I do think there's, as General Thibault said, there's a growing understanding from Canadians that the world is a scarier place and that we do need to do more. So you cited the Angus Reid poll. There was an earlier Abacus poll from about a year ago that said Canadians also want us to do more on foreign policy and defense. So I think Canadians understand, foreign policy and development. Canadians understand that the international level matters very much to us. So when Dr. Leubrecht said, it could be seen as a binary choice between do we focus on our Canadian forces on sovereignty at home or do we deploy internationally, I think that's a false binary. I don't think the kinds of threats we're facing right now can be parceled out that way. Most of the threats that are hitting Canada right now are things, so for instance, melting in our Arctic, increased competition in our Arctic. Where does that come from? That comes from melting sea ice. And the answer to it can be found by working more closely with our Arctic allies, all of whom except Russia and NATO right now, to do better military, not just Arctic warfighting, but sharing information, situational awareness, et cetera, that kind of thing. So the alliance and working with allies on those kinds of threats that hit us now, we need those allies. Another example, cyber or disinformation that rattles our democracies. Those are areas that are all discussed at NATO. We use NATO as both a political and a military forum to share lessons with allies about how you respond to those external threats. So Canada needs to work with those allies to respond to those threats. It's not just focus on at home, try and protect by ourselves with a less reliable American partner, try and protect our own sovereign airspace, territory, and maritime, or work with allies. We have to work with allies to protect our own sovereignty. What the alliance also brings is a ready table of other allies where we can do a division of labor. Canada needs to think through in a more structured, strategic way what we're good at, what our forces are good at, what responds to our security interests most, and then work with allies to do that kind of division of labor. Because I personally don't think there's any world in which our Canadian Armed Forces can be large enough for us to be able to go at anywhere near alone to protect our sovereignty.
Christian.
Well, I always think of defense spending, and I think this is what the poll reinforces, as an insurance policy. And it's ultimately a question of what premium are we willing to pay for the environment in which we get, and what coverage are you prepared to buy? And what Canadians are telling us that they believe that we need more coverage and a higher premium precisely because of the complex developments that Ambassador Buck lays out. And if you look at the last 30 years, what the Canadian Armed Forces does today that the Canadian Armed Forces did not do even at the end of the Cold War, you can see that the expectations of the Canadian Armed Forces are ever expanding, and yet you're having to do this in an environment where you're overutilized and consistently undercapitalized.
Let's see if we can put a couple of solutions on the table here. And all right, let's try this problem. We are understaffed right now in the Canadian Forces in a major way. General, how would you get more people to join?
Well, first of all, the good news is that there's a lot of interest in the Canadian Forces. In fact, this past year, 66,000 applications into the Canadian Forces.
How many did you accept?
4,000 is what this year's intake will be, and it's well below what it needs to be, especially when you put it in the context of, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the problem with keeping people with the organization.
Can you explain that, though? If we get 66,000 people who want in,
Yeah.
and less than 1% are actually taken, why did so many get rejected?
Well, so there's a number of challenges that the recruiting group, I think, is running into. But suffice to say that I think they're working diligently in sort of tackling all of those problems. Those are everything from the security clearances to the medical clearances to making sure that the folks that are actually applying will actually be able to succeed in the military. And there's a lot of interest, but it may not be the right fit. So there's many reasons for that low number, but certainly they're moving in directions where, in fact, the intake, I think, is going to meet the expectation. But it's going to take time. This it's not a short time fix, and the problem after you've got people in is to train them. And this is where some of the challenges come in terms of some of the budgetary restrictions that are going on. We're protecting our capital programs for investments in the future, but we're squeezing the organization in its operations and its training and its maintenance, and that is material readiness. It's the training readiness of those people that we're bringing into the forces. So it's a wicked problem to try to solve, but we have to keep attracting people. The good news is that 30% of those applicants are women, 20% are visible minority, 1/3 are permanent residents. So the problem isn't attracting people. I think there's a great value proposition for members for Canadians to see themselves in the Canadian Forces, and I think that's the good news. We got to work through the problems that are impeding us getting them into the system and trained.
And how do we do that?
Well, so there's two quick challenges. One is on the quantity side, that the interest is not distributed evenly across the country and among population groups. So, and ultimately, when you have an organization such as the Canadian Armed Forces, you want them to be representative of the society and the norms that ultimately, when the government deploys. The other is a quality challenge, that the Canadian Armed Forces, like so many other, is a high-tech organization that is struggling to compete for the same high-quality talent, but it doesn't have the agility that the private sector has to attract that particular talent. And we can see this in terms of many of the fantastic capital purchases that we are making and that the government is likely going to announce. We're going to have significant challenges to operate because we don't have the personnel today to operate it, let alone the personnel tomorrow.
I'm thinking usually when you want more people in, you double the pay, you make the pensions better. I mean, those kinds of things, I presume, are not going to work in this situation if the people who are applying are not qualified.
Well, and I think you start, first of all, I think the compensation and pay packages for the members of the Canadian Forces is actually pretty good. I don't think that when people are leaving, they're not leaving for issues of pay or compensation. I think they're leaving for issues of quality of life. They're facing the same challenges that a lot of Canadians are facing: housing, inflation. We've got a nomadic lifestyle in the military where you're asking families to uproot and move, going between one province, can't find a family doctor. So those are the things that are really, I think, causing members of the forces right now to look for other things to do. But the pay and compensation, I think, is quite attractive for Canadians to kind of look at the Canadian Forces, but they have to see that they're joining a team and an organization that's valued and is going somewhere. And that's why I do think that the government has to really tell Canadians where they're going with the armed forces and tell members of the forces themselves, this is where this institution is going, this is where you fit, this is the value, this is why this is so important. And I think that that's kind of missing right now.
We just have a couple of minutes left, and Kerry Buck, let me put this to you. And I asked the question aware of the fact that much of the country was quite captivated over the last little while by the death of Brian Mulroney, because it kind of reminded, I think, a lot of people in the country that when he was the Prime Minister, we were kind of heavy hitters on the world stage. We punched above our weight, and we were influential in the highest halls of power in this world. We're certainly not anymore, and I'm not taking a poke at the current Prime Minister. We haven't been in a while. So my question for you is, what advice would you give the current government in terms of one thing we could do to be more important on the world stage right now?
That's a big question. At NATO, to regain some of our political clout, we have to have a path to 2%. It's just needed in the political conversation right now. But the question you asked was much bigger than that. In the past, in my experience, Canada has made a name for itself internationally by being a generator of ideas. NATO was a Canadian idea at the beginning. Under Prime Minister Harper, it was maternal and child health. Under the previous Liberal government, it was the landmines treaty. And under the current government, there have been a couple actually, but I'd say putting our troops back in Europe, in Latvia, the battle group is, for me anyway, it's a big deal. So we usually lead with ideas. And then when you build a table, allies come to that table because you've invested in those relationships over time. They're like insurance, so that allies will come to the table alongside a Canadian idea, like landmines, like maternal child health, like human security, and the list goes on. So I think regaining some of that policy confidence and those policy skills and regaining the tools we need at the international level. And here I'm not just talking defense, I mean defense development diplomacy. We can't separate out and see the international as something optional, as we have for most of our history as a country. What happens internationally touches us directly. It touches Canadians' pocketbooks directly, their health directly, and their security directly. So not investing in international across the board is really shooting ourselves in the foot. The problem is we won't see it until it's too late. So I really do think, I made the plug for an integrated policy review, but I think more focus on international. Canadians are ready for it, and I think leadership is required to generate those international ideas and to leave room and take risk and generate Canadian policy ideas, Canadian initiatives that can honestly build the kind of world Canada needs in what is a very much more dangerous environment that we're living in right now.
That's Carrie Buck, former Canadian ambassador to NATO, now a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa. Thank you for being there for us, and we hope that your broken foot gets better soon so that we can see you in studio next time. Guy Thibault, the retired Lieutenant General of the Canadian Army, Christian Leuprecht, RMC, and Queen's University, thanks for making the trip to Toronto for us as well. We're really grateful.
Thank you, Stephen.
Pleasure.
Unpredictable weather meant an early start this year for sugar maples and Canada's favorite condiment. Here's that story.
When I was a kid growing up, we had snow like it seemed like forever. Snowshoeing was a big part, going sleigh riding, hunting in the wintertime, wearing snowshoes, fishing on the ice. Cindy Bay hasn't froze over for a couple of years now. As a kid, I remember that bay usually froze over in February. It hasn't frozen at all this year. There's been ice along the shorelines. Some of the little inner harbors and that, maybe they have a little bit of ice on them, but the bay itself hasn't frozen over.
When we look at where sugar maples will be comfortable with the impacts of climate change in maybe 2070, 2080, they'd have to go up to the Hudson Bay coast. They'd go over to Quebec, to the eastern side of James Bay, rather than down to southern Ontario and the Niagara Peninsula. That's what the maps for the 2050s, 2070s, end of the century look like.
My name is Nathan Kishik. I work with the Chippewas-Nawash First Nation. I manage the Cape Coker Park and our maple syrup enterprise, Zaboticon Maple. And today we're here to talk about climate change and maple syrup production.
I'm David Pearson. I'm a retired professor from Laurentian University. I came here as a geologist. I took 6 years leave to be the project director for Science North, and that led me to become interested in climate change.
I really loved working in parks. I always thought that that's where I belonged. And it was a good opportunity for me to return back to my home and try to make some sense out of what was happening here and what could I bring to make this band operation a success. One of the biggest thrills I get is that I've walked every inch of this bush where we put trees and You see the same trees year after year. There's a quick way of testing to see what the diameter of the tree is, for example. That if you can hug a tree and your fingers don't touch, that's probably 18 inches. And that's what I enjoy doing. I get out and measuring trees and hugging trees just to see that everything is still there.
The tree might look inactive at the moment. It may look as though it's doing nothing. But in fact, what's happening right up at the tips of the branches is that there's some evaporation taking place. And there's also, during the warmth of warm days, there's also some melting taking place, melting of ice in some of the cells, and that is reducing the compression, is allowing the sugar to move through the outside part of the tree. This is a cross-section not of a sugar maple, but of a silver maple, and it's coming down the tree, and it's coming out of the hole that you see that's been drilled there. Sugar, water, sap. That store that's beneath my feet in the roots is what the tree will use and will draw up to the leaves during the next summer. Because as the leaves are growing and manufacturing sucrose, manufacturing sugar, water is also evaporating from the surface of the leaves. The tree is transpiring. The transpiration of the tree is keeping the leaves cool, and not only is it keeping the leaves cool, it's cooling this yard. It's cooling the house. It's cooling the environment around it. So it's acting like an air conditioner.
I remember the first year that we were putting taps up, there was so much snow out there that we were hanging our taps, not realizing how much snow there was. So when it come time to pull the taps out, some of the taps were like 7, 8 feet above us after the snow had gone in. We had these long extractors in for pulling the taps out, and we still had to jump up in some places to reach up and pull the taps out. So the last couple of years we haven't had to wear snowshoes at all when we're out tapping. This year I was looking at the temperatures going up, and then it's been such an unusual Christmas time. There was no snow, the grounds are bare. You could actually see when I was looking across the bay that some of the trees, in particular the aspen, looked like they were ready to start flushing in the 1st of January. Like you see the tops of the trees, just there's a different shade to the buds are starting to push. And I could see that from my place and say, oh my God, what's going on here? And geez, it was so surprising that for that time of year, and it was just getting above zero, that as soon as I put the tap in, the sap was there immediately. So we looked at the long-range forecast and said, we're going to be getting almost a week of this weather, so we should try and make the most of it. So we changed plans right away and we started tapping. That was the second week in February that we were tapping.
A tree of this size would draw about 200 litres of water a day. And a family bathtub is about 300 litres. So it's a lot of water. A big oak would draw twice that, 400, maybe even 500 litres a day. But what it tells you is how critical the moisture is in the soil for every tree, including the sugar maple.
We've seen severe weather during the summertime, and the storms seem to be more violent. There's been little F0 tornadoes so close to the community, and I myself have observed more water spouts than, as a kid, I never saw water spouts. I think as a sugar maker, or as somebody that depends on that as a livelihood, you just have to be ready to adapt yourself to whatever the conditions change. Maybe you have to start your harvesting early. I've heard people talking about maybe giving the trees a rest and not harvesting at all.
If your livelihood depends on the output of your maple sugar trees, then you need to do two things. You need to make sure that the trees are not too close to each other, because if they are too close to each other, their roots will overlap and they'll be competing for water. You don't want competition. The other thing that you need to do is to make sure that they're getting the water they need. Water is really, really critical in summer for not just trees, every plant, garden flowers and whatever it might be. And when the ground is bare, and let's say we're in the middle of June and the average temperature is usually 20 degrees on the soil, and the average temperature on the next week is 21 degrees, then 15% more water will evaporate from that soil surface than when the temperature was 20 degrees. The other aspect of water in summer is that for every degree increase in air temperature, the air can hold 7% more water. Water molecule stays in the air 9 days, which means that that extra 7% water is going to rain out somewhere. And if the increase in air temperature is 2 degrees or 3 degrees or 4 degrees, then all the more water can be held by the atmosphere. And what that's beginning to result in is extreme rainfall, very heavy rain. One of the consequences of extreme rainfall is erosion. That can be very severe on ecosystems of all kinds, but also for sugar maple trees, because they need to be able to draw their nutrients from the soil, and if they lose that soil, then that's not good for their long-term health. The other part of the water source for a sugar maple tree, and for any tree actually, is the precipitation that falls in the winter. And if we've got enough snow, it can be a source of water for the spring growth for the tree and the beginning of the summer as well. So it's not just what falls as rainfall, it's what fell during the winter and melts and feeds the soil water. That's what you want. You want a long, slow melt. Not a sudden one, because if you get a sudden melt, then the ground may still be frozen and the water runs off. Straight into a lake, straight into a creek. That's no good for maple trees.
I had come across a map before that identified the location as being Jeganathan. And I didn't know what that meant until I asked somebody that could speak Ojibwe, and they just said that was a sugar bush. And I guess historically that has always been the sugar bush for our people. Our people had been here for forever, or for time immemorial. I remember as a kid that my grandfather would make maple syrup up in that area. The first tap ceremony was something I thought was was very important for us to do. Our people had always gave thanks, or would give thanks, or lay down tobacco, hoping that we're going to do our harvesting in a good way. We're hoping for the best harvest that we can get. So it brings people from the community to come and share their experience as well, and have a little bit of a meal, and there's some storytelling and some singing and some dancing, and some people find it very emotional. I had people in the community come up to me and he says, that maple syrup operation has really put us on the map. They're so proud of that. So our maple syrup has literally gone all over the world so far. There are so many opportunities here. So many people in southern Ontario, that aren't very far away from here anymore. Like the highways and everything have improved. If we have success with this, then we can employ more people. We can, I'm hoping, have sustainable employment opportunities for the people of Chippewas and Awash. The Cape Cooker Park is pretty much self-sustaining now with this operation as well. I think it's important to know that the wages for the people that are working here now have gone up steadily over the last few years. People can look at having a place that they can make a career of, like you don't have to leave home to make yourself a living wage anymore. There's opportunities here.
In the collaborations that I've been lucky enough to become involved in with remote First Nations, fly-in First Nations that depend on ice roads in the winter, I've learned that what one needs to do in order to be able to talk about the ways that those climate change impacts they're feeling the risks can be lowered, that they can adapt to those changes. One needs to take Western science, my knowledge from my university and reading books and so forth, and the observations of First Nations, what they've seen happening, what elders can talk about, and the changes they've seen, to put those two knowledges together.
My grandfather used barrels and iron kettles. We have a high pressure vacuum pump that we can start drawing in from all over the forest and bring that to one central point, and that's where our sugar house is. We use reverse osmosis, which is like a water desalinization plant. We have a 1,135 gallon storage tank for that, and we set that upstairs along with our concentrate. We use a wood-fired evaporator. It's capable of boiling off like 200 gallons an hour. The vacuum situation, the vacuum pump, very important for us. We've got so many lines that are out and everything is numbered, and when we're out putting the lines in place, one of the salesmen come up with me and he says, "Oh, did you know there's an app you can get for your operation where you can monitor your vacuum just by using your phone?" So I went out and we bought the system, and we put it, I think we have 9 sensors out, and we can tell by looking on our app what the vacuum pressure is there, as well as the temperature and the battery. So it helps us identify where our leaks are, where we have our trouble spots, to maximize our harvest as well. And very fun to be able to show off a little bit. We're still learning as we go along.
What happens when a forest leads children's learning? Here's a program in Niagara that finds out.
So my name is Dr. Deborah Harwood, and I'm with Brock University, and I'm a faculty and academic member in the Department of Educational Studies. I particularly work with really young children, so, birth to about grade 3. And when you think about young children and how they learn, it's all through curiosity.
When I was going out, I thought a fish was sleeping.
They're curious. They want to explore the world, they want to touch and feel and make sense of the world. So it's just a natural element of being in the world.
How does it look today? Is it moving fast? Is it moving slow? What do you think?
Fast.
Fast.
It just makes sense to really examine curiosity and then blend it with the outdoors and think about what is it about the outdoors that offers really specific and kind of unbounded opportunities for curiosity to blossom for young children. So one of their programs is a forest kindy program. I brought this idea to them several years ago because I really wanted to kind of bring that idea of forest schools to our campus. And they're great to partner with. They're always game to try out new and exciting kind of pedagogical principles. So they were really engaged with the idea of letting the forest kind of lead children's learning.
What kind of animals are in danger if we're in a forest fire? You don't know.
Deer.
Deer.
The bumblebee.
forest? Do we have lions in our forest?
Yes.
Come on.
Tricked ya.
I know you tricked me.
Yeah, but
So again, being out immersed in the woods, letting children have the agency to kind of follow their interests, develop all of holistically, because I mean, you are out there, you're watching them, they're engaged physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, as well as, you know, their thinking skills and their cognitive skills. So they were really a great group to partner with, because they really believed in the philosophy, they really believed in reconnecting children to nature. And we have a beautiful campus in Niagara for Brock University. We have a very unique kind of biosphere right there that the children could really engage with and learn about. And Rosenblauer was very vested from the very get-go. They were very interested in the idea.
I'm Suzanne Robitaille. I'm a registered early childhood educator and a forest school practitioner. So today we have set up some art, so painting with watercolor paints, and we have a tether line for balance and core strength. And we also have some tree blocks that we made ourselves and some little fairy dolls for dramatic play.
I'm not even falling
No,
this
you're
time.
doing great. Right till the word stops. We have an interesting split this year. It's 5 girls and 3 boys. So the dramatic play things like fairy dolls are big for girls. But they all kind of enjoy it and they all like to do art. The tether rope is kind of a new thing that we're trying out. As the year progresses, we get to do more and more risk-inspired things. Sometimes they just get an idea in their head.
It's gonna rain.
Maybe later, yeah. Yesterday we stopped and listened to the birds and tried to see different ones because they're starting to come back. So it all depends on what they notice, what they see. When we had the snow, there was tons of tracks from different animals, so that really inspired them. The walk was very long to get here because we had to stop for every track and decipher if it was a dog or a coyote or if it was a mouse or a vole. Like, it was fun.
I think what's really beneficial about the forest is that it is so open. So it's not bounded. Like, there's no scripts out there. So if you think about a toy, typically a toy is defined by an adult that's created with some expectations. You know, a truck looks like a truck. Children tend to play with it like a truck. But if you think of a stick or a pine cone or a tree even, there's no embedded expectations of what that could be. So for children, you know, it just kind of unleashes their imagination and curiosity. The stick can be absolutely anything. We've seen it as, you know, a magic wand, a seatbelt, a dump truck. It can be part of their walls that they build when they build their den. So there's just something about the outdoors that it's not scripted. You know, the materials are typically loose parts that they can manipulate any which way they want. And it really fosters that opportunity for kids to be, you know, follow their interests, but, you know, and really kind of use their curiosity to kind of direct their activities. I think that we should place more of an emphasis on curiosity. You know, children should have a chance when they're learning to really use their questions. So they have questions about the world, they have questions of how things work, they have questions about, you know, why is this hill deteriorating after the rain. So those are the kind of things that we want to tap into as educators. So we have the children's inquiry questions and we follow their leads based on their curiosity. Because what happens with curiosity is part of the cycle of, you know, inquiry. Yes, they're curious, they have questions, but really when you think about it, it's almost like the scientific method. They, you know, come up with hypotheses, you know, why does this work? Why is this puddle here? Those types of things. They test out their theories, they come to a conclusion, and they kind of deepen their learning through this kind of inquiry cycle.
Usually the kids pick everything that they want to do, so I offer suggestions. Whether or not they follow my suggestions is another story. You guys are playing lava?
Now we're playing
Firefighters now? What kind of fire? What kind of fire? A building fire, a forest fire? A forest fire? Oh my goodness. Quite often we have votes on where to go in this forest because we have a lake. So sometimes we go there, sometimes we choose a hike instead of camp. So we get to try different things. And the kids are the ones that make the choices and do the voting. Once upon a time on this land called lived the First Nations people. They learn a lot about teamwork. They learn a lot about the environment. We do the land acknowledgement every time we come out, and they are learning to respect the land. Sometimes I learn about different animals from them because they dig things up that I wouldn't dig up. I love bugs, but I'm not one for the slimy stuff. So we've learned about all different kinds of salamanders while we've been here. Each kid is different and you just learn something different from them. It's kind of neat. They have brilliant minds and brilliant questions, and it's fun just to follow, and I don't give them the answers. We usually just make theories on their ideas and how things happen and why things happen. If they're really determined that they need to know the exact why, when we go back, we'll go on the tablet and we'll search it up on Google and see what it is, that kind of thing. But usually they make their own choices, they make their own ideas, and they just figure it out.
I think the other aspect of curiosity is it's kind of coupled with creativity. So there's this wonderful thing that happens, creative solutions, problem solving. And so there's this really nice kind of nexus that happens if we really focus on the children's curiosity, and then we allow them the space and the time to come up with these creative solutions. And that's what we need in the world. We need creative solutions going forward.
I think it's a great program, and I think kids learn a lot. I know I learn different things each year from the children because each year is different. So I think if a child gets an experience to do this, I think they really should.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
One of the worst things you could do, or one of the biggest sins in political life, would be releasing the details of a budget before the embargo has lifted. We always get very stern warnings about that.
Definitely a faux pas. They really read us the riot act on that.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.